Camp Alva, Oklahoma, June 3, 1943, 0800 hours. And Obergefreiter Klaus Steiner, recently captured in Tunisia and transported across the Atlantic with 2,000 other Afrika Korps prisoners, stands in the processing line at his first American POW camp, bracing himself for the brutal treatment that Nazi propaganda has prepared him to expect: starvation rations, sadistic guards, forced labor unto death, and systematic degradation that propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels assured all German soldiers awaited any man unfortunate enough to fall into American hands. Steiner has been a soldier for 4 years, believed everything the Reich told him about the subhuman nature of Americans and their Jewish-controlled government's hatred of Germans, and now prepares mentally to endure whatever tortures his captors devise, while maintaining his dignity and loyalty to the fatherland. What Obergefreiter Steiner cannot possibly know, what no German prisoner arriving in America can comprehend despite the evidence of their own eyes, is that within 24 hours he will consume more calories than he's eaten in any single day during the past year of North African combat, that he will sleep in a bed with clean sheets for the first time since leaving Germany, that American guards will address him as soldier rather than with the epithets he expects, and that over the next 2 years his experience as a prisoner in America will so thoroughly contradict everything Nazi ideology taught him that he will return to Germany in 1946 as a vocal advocate for democracy, free speech, and the very liberal values that he once fought to destroy. One of 450,000 German POWs whose encounter with American society while imprisoned created the philosophical and ideological foundation for post-war Germany's transformation into a democratic state, allied with the West, rather than bitter enemies seeking revenge. The expectations of German prisoners arriving in America derive from systematic propaganda that Nazi authorities disseminated throughout the Wehrmacht, depicting Americans as a mongrel race of inferior genetics dominated by Jewish manipulation, incapable of military excellence, and motivated by savage hatred toward Germans. Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, captured in Sicily in July 1943 and transported to Camp Como, Mississippi, carries in his mind vivid propaganda images from Der Stürmer and other Nazi publications, cartoons showing American soldiers as brutish gangsters, articles describing American prison camps as death factories where German soldiers are worked to death or executed arbitrarily, and speeches by Goebbels warning that capture by Americans means certain death through starvation, disease, or outright murder. Hoffmann, educated at Heidelberg University before the war, intellectually doubts some propaganda excesses, but has been conditioned by 4 years of Nazi indoctrination to accept the fundamental premise that Americans represent civilization's enemies and that Jewish influence over American society makes humane treatment of German prisoners impossible.
The conditions German soldiers experienced during their final months of combat, particularly those fighting in North Africa and Italy during 1942 to 1943, create physical and psychological states that make the contrast with American captivity even more shocking. Gefreiter Hans Weber, captured at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, has survived on reduced rations for 6 months as German supply lines in Africa collapsed, has gone weeks without adequate medical care for wounds and illnesses, and has watched dozens of comrades die from starvation, disease, and inadequate medical supplies. Weber's physical condition at capture, malnourished, suffering from dysentery, infected wounds that German field hospitals couldn't treat, represents typical state of German prisoners arriving from Mediterranean theaters. His mental state combines relief at surviving capture with terror about what captivity might bring, conditioned by propaganda to expect treatment far worse than the privations he's already endured. The transportation of German POWs to America, while involving the discomforts of weeks at sea in converted cargo vessels, provides first hints that American treatment might differ from propaganda predictions. The transport ships, while crowded and uncomfortable, provide adequate food, standard U.S. Army rations that exceed what most German soldiers have eaten in months. Medical personnel treat sick and wounded prisoners, providing medications and care that German military medical services couldn't deliver during the war's later stages. American guards, while maintaining security, don't engage in the arbitrary brutality or systematic degradation that prisoners expect. Feldwebel Otto Schneider, transported from Italy to Norfolk, Virginia in August 1943, notes in his diary, "The Americans feed us twice daily. Not well, but adequately. They have treated our wounded. The guards are professional but not cruel. I remain uncertain what fate awaits us in America, but the voyage suggests treatment may not be as propaganda described." The processing of arriving German POWs at American camps follows procedures designed to comply with Geneva Convention requirements, while also gathering intelligence and beginning assessment of prisoners' political reliability. Camp Alva, one of approximately 500 POW camps established throughout the United States between 1942 and 1945, processes Obergefreiter Steiner through systematic procedures, medical examination and treatment of any conditions requiring attention, delousing and provision of clean uniforms, photographing and documentation, interrogation by intelligence officers seeking tactical information, and classification into categories ranging from ardent Nazi to anti-Nazi that will determine housing assignments and privileges. The processing, while bureaucratic and time-consuming, proceeds with efficiency and basic humanity that surprises prisoners expecting deliberate degradation.
Major Thomas Harrison, Commandant of Camp Alva, understands his responsibilities under both Geneva Convention and U.S. War Department directives that emphasize humane treatment, adequate provisioning, and eventual re-education of German prisoners. Harrison, a career Army officer who studied in Germany during the 1930s and speaks fluent German, views his role as maintaining security while demonstrating to prisoners that democratic society treats even enemies with basic human dignity. His approach reflects broader American policy that anticipated post-war rehabilitation of Germany and recognized that humane treatment of POWs serves both moral imperatives and pragmatic interests in encouraging German surrender and creating positive impressions of American society. The physical conditions at Camp Alva and similar facilities throughout the American POW camp system shock arriving prisoners through contrast with their expectations and recent experiences. The barracks, while basic military construction, provide shelter far superior to what most German soldiers experienced during combat. Wooden buildings with proper roofing, heating systems for winter, adequate ventilation, and capacity sufficient that prisoners aren't overcrowded. Each prisoner receives a bed with mattress, pillow, and blankets, luxuries that frontline German soldiers hadn't experienced in years. Latrines and washing facilities, while communal and utilitarian, function properly with running water and adequate supplies. Steiner, assigned to Barracks 7 with 40 other prisoners, notes the contrast with his last months in Africa, where his unit slept in foxholes or damaged buildings, often went weeks without bathing, and used whatever materials they could scavenge for bedding. The food provided to German POWs represents perhaps the most immediate and visceral contradiction of Nazi propaganda that predicted starvation. Geneva Convention requires that POW rations equal those provided to captor nations' own troops, and American authorities generally comply with this standard, meaning German prisoners receive the same 3,000 to 4,000 calorie daily rations that American soldiers consume. The mess hall at Camp Alva serves 3 meals daily. Breakfast typically includes eggs, bacon or sausage, bread, butter, coffee, and sometimes fruit. Lunch provides meat, vegetables, bread, and dessert. Dinner offers similar variety with different preparations. For prisoners who have survived on reduced field rations or worse, the quantity and quality of American camp food proves almost incomprehensible. Gefreiter Weber, experiencing his first full day at Camp Como, describes in his diary the cognitive dissonance of abundant food. Breakfast included 2 eggs, 4 strips of bacon, 3 slices of bread with butter and jam, and coffee with sugar and cream. I ate until my shrunken stomach could hold no more, and Americans threw away food we left uneaten. This cannot be real. Either we are being fattened for some purpose, or American wealth exceeds anything we imagined. No German soldiers eat like this, not even officers. The propaganda said Americans would starve us, but I have eaten more in one day than I consumed in a week during my last months in Italy.
The medical care provided to German POWs, while varying somewhat by camp and available resources, generally meets or exceeds Geneva Convention requirements and proves vastly superior to what German military medical services could provide during the war's later stages. Camp physicians examine all arriving prisoners, treat immediate medical needs, and provide ongoing care for chronic conditions. Obergefreiter Steiner, suffering from untreated dysentery and infected wounds at arrival, receives immediate antibiotic treatment, wound cleaning and dressing, and several days of rest with enhanced rations to aid recovery. The American medical staff treats him with professional competence and basic human concern that contradicts everything he expected: no degradation, no denial of care, no suggestion that enemy status means unworthy of treatment. The recreational facilities and opportunities provided at American POW camps represent aspects of captivity that prisoners could not possibly anticipate based on Nazi propaganda. Camp Alva includes athletic fields where prisoners organize soccer matches, volleyball games, and track competitions. A camp library stocks thousands of books in German, carefully screened to exclude Nazi propaganda, but including classic literature, technical works, and current periodicals. Arts and crafts workshops provide materials for prisoners interested in woodworking, painting, or other creative pursuits. A canteen allows prisoners to purchase small luxury items, cigarettes, candy, toiletries, using scrip earned through work assignments. Entertainment includes movies shown weekly in the camp theater, concerts performed by musically talented prisoners, and theatrical productions organized by prisoner committees. Lieutenant Hoffman, educated and culturally sophisticated before the war, finds the recreational opportunities both welcome and philosophically troubling. He writes to his family, letters that American censors review but generally allow. The Americans permit us to form an orchestra. We have found among the prisoners several accomplished musicians, and the camp authorities provided instruments. We performed Beethoven last week for an audience of prisoners and American officers. The Americans applauded. I cannot reconcile this with what we were told about American barbarism. Either the propaganda lied systematically, or these Americans are unique exceptions. But I have spoken with prisoners in other camps, and they report similar treatment. Something in our understanding was fundamentally wrong. The work program for German POWs, while mandatory under Geneva Convention provisions allowing captor nations to employ enlisted prisoners in non-military labor, provides experiences that further challenge prisoners' preconceptions about American society. German POWs work on farms throughout agricultural regions, in food processing facilities, in forestry operations, and on various infrastructure projects, all tasks that support the American war effort while complying with conventions against military labor. The work arrangements introduce prisoners to American civilians, allow observation of American society's functioning, and provide interactions that humanize both captors and captives in ways propaganda never acknowledged possible. Feldwebel Schneider, assigned to work on a cotton farm in Mississippi, describes encounters that transform his understanding. The American farmer who supervises our work treats us as laborers, not as hated enemies. He provides water during hot days, allows rest breaks, and occasionally shares lunch with us. Yesterday, his wife sent cookies. When I asked why they treat us kindly, the farmer said, "You're soldiers like our boys overseas. The war isn't your fault any more than it's theirs. We're all just men trying to survive. This simple humanity contradicts everything we learned about Americans as soulless materialists, incapable of honor or compassion. The educational and re-education programs implemented at POW camps, while controversial among American policymakers and varying in intensity across different facilities, represent systematic efforts to expose German prisoners to democratic ideas, accurate history, and philosophical alternatives to Nazi ideology. The programs, developed by the U.S. War Department's Special Projects Division, include classes in American history and government, discussion groups examining democratic political theory, exposure to uncensored news and information about the war's progress, and eventually confrontation with documented evidence of Nazi atrocities that propaganda had denied or justified. The programs avoid heavy-handed indoctrination. American educators recognize that obvious propaganda generates resistance, instead emphasizing intellectual inquiry, factual information, and philosophical examination. Obergefreiter Steiner, elected to Camp Alva's prisoner council after several months, describes the psychological impact. "We elect representatives by voting. Every prisoner's vote counts equally, even mine as a mere Obergefreiter. In the German military, rank is everything, and orders flow downward without question. Here, Americans insist that we make collective decisions about how to organize our lives within the camp. Initially, this seemed weak and inefficient, but I observed that when men have voice in decisions affecting them, they cooperate more willingly than when they simply receive orders. Perhaps democracy is not weakness, but different form of strength." The information about the war's progress that reaches German POWs through approved newspapers, radio broadcasts, and eventually direct observation of American society creates cognitive dissonance as propaganda's claims contradict obvious reality. Prisoners learn about Allied victories, the invasion of France, the liberation of Paris, the advance into Germany, through American news sources that, while certainly presenting American perspectives, report actual events rather than the fantasy victories that Nazi propaganda broadcasts to Germany. The contrast between propaganda claims and obvious reality forces thoughtful prisoners to question what other Nazi claims might be false. Lieutenant Hoffman, reading American newspapers and listening to radio broadcasts during 1944, writes, "The propaganda claimed Germany was winning, that Americans were incompetent, that final victory approached. But I am imprisoned in America, a nation of unimaginable wealth and industrial capacity. I see American abundance firsthand. The newspapers report Allied advances that match what prisoners arriving from Europe describe. Either the entire American nation is engaged in an elaborate deception specifically for POW benefit, or the propaganda systematically lied. The latter seems more probable. If they lied about America and the war's progress, what else was false?" The exposure to American civilian society that work assignments provide introduces German prisoners to aspects of democratic culture that propaganda never accurately described. Prisoners working on farms observe American prosperity, the abundance of consumer goods, the widespread ownership of automobiles, the casual equality between economic classes that contrasts sharply with German social hierarchies. They witness Americans criticizing their own government openly without fear of arrest. They see newspapers printing diverse opinions, including criticism of government policies. They observe that Jews, rather than being the parasitic controllers of society that propaganda depicted, are simply fellow citizens integrated into normal American life. Gefreiter Weber, working at a food processing plant in Texas, describes observations that transform his worldview. The American workers are casual and familiar with their supervisors in ways that would be impossible in Germany. They joke, disagree openly, and show no fear of authority. The plant manager is Jewish. I know because one worker mentioned it casually. He is simply another American businessman, not the sinister puppet master of propaganda. Everything I was taught about America and Jews appears to be lies. The question haunts me. If they lied about this, what else was false? What was the real purpose of the war? Were we the aggressors fighting for unjust conquest rather than defending Germany as propaganda claimed? The letters that German POWs write home, while censored by American authorities to remove sensitive information, nevertheless convey impressions of American treatment and society that begin influencing opinions within Germany. Families receiving letters describing adequate food, humane treatment, and relative freedom create cognitive dissonance with propagandist claims about American brutality. The letters, circulating among extended families and communities, plant seeds of doubt about other Nazi claims. American censors recognize this soft propaganda value and generally allow letters describing positive treatment to pass, understanding that German civilians learning about POW experiences indirectly undermines Nazi ideology more effectively than direct propaganda. Feldwebel Schneider's letter to his wife, written in December 1943, exemplifies the cautious but subversive message many prisoners send. I am well and properly treated. The food is adequate and we have warm shelter. The Americans follow conventions regarding prisoners, and we are not mistreated. I work on a farm with other prisoners, and the Americans supervise us professionally. I have learned some English, and the Americans are not as we were told. Please do not worry about my conditions. They are satisfactory. I hope you and the children are well and that the war ends soon so that I may return home. The gradual psychological transformation of German POWs from Nazi true believers to skeptics to eventual democratic advocates occurs at different rates for different prisoners, influenced by education, intelligence, ideological commitment, and personal experiences. The process typically begins with grudging acknowledgement that American treatment exceeds propaganda predictions, progresses through questioning of other Nazi claims, and eventually, for many prisoners, results in fundamental rejection of Nazi ideology and embrace of democratic values. The transformation rarely occurs suddenly or completely, instead developing through accumulating contradictions between indoctrination and observed reality. The confrontation with documented evidence of Nazi atrocities represents the most psychologically devastating component of the re-education process, as German POWs who dismissed earlier propaganda claims as exaggeration encounter photographic proof, survivor testimony, and documentary evidence that cannot be explained away or rationalized. The Special Projects Division carefully sequences this exposure, first establishing that American sources prove reliable through verifiable information about the war's progress, then gradually introducing evidence of concentration camps, genocide, and systematic murder that Nazi propaganda either denied entirely or justified as necessary security measures. The revelation proves traumatic even for prisoners who had become skeptical of Nazi ideology, forcing them to confront that they served a regime responsible for crimes exceeding anything their worst fears imagined. Major Harrison, implementing the atrocity exposure program at Camp Alva in early 1945 as concentration camps are liberated, understands the psychological risks but believes German prisoners must confront truth about the regime they served. The approach employs multiple evidence types: newsreel footage showing Allied forces liberating camps, photographs documenting conditions and mass graves, affidavits from survivors describing systematic murder, and eventually visits by concentration camp survivors who speak to assembled prisoners. The presentations avoid sensationalism but present evidence methodically and comprehensively, making denial psychologically impossible for anyone willing to examine facts honestly. Lieutenant Hoffmann, viewing newsreel footage from Buchenwald in April 1945, experiences complete psychological collapse of his worldview. He writes in his diary, "I watched American soldiers liberating a camp near Weimar. The footage showed piles of corpses, living skeletons barely alive, cremation ovens, and systematic facilities for mass murder." The American narrator explained calmly what these images documented. Many prisoners in the theater wept. Others shouted that this must be propaganda, that Americans created these scenes to justify their aggression. But I recognized the landscape, the buildings, the German signs. This was real. We did this. I served a regime that murdered millions. Everything I believed, everything I fought for, was a lie built on genocide. How does one continue living with this knowledge? The psychological crisis that confronts German POWs upon learning about the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities manifests differently across the prisoner population based on prior ideological commitment, intellectual sophistication, and psychological resilience. Hardcore Nazis deny the evidence as fabricated propaganda, some becoming even more fanatically committed to Nazi ideology as psychological defense against cognitive dissonance. A larger group experiences what psychologists would later term moral injury, the psychological trauma of discovering they participated in or supported profoundly evil actions. The most common response involves gradual acceptance accompanied by attempts to rationalize personal culpability. I personally didn't commit these crimes. I was following orders. I didn't know this was happening. Not all Germans supported this.
Obergefreiter Steiner, confronting evidence of the Holocaust in spring 1945, undergoes intellectual and moral reckoning that transforms his understanding of the war and his participation in it. His diary entries from this period document the psychological process. April 15th. They showed us films from the camps. I cannot believe what I saw. April 18th. A survivor of Auschwitz spoke to us, an old Jewish man who lost his entire family. I could not meet his eyes. April 25th. I am trying to understand how this happened, how we allowed this. The propaganda trained us to see Jews as dangerous enemies, but genocide? How did an entire nation participate in or ignore mass murder? May 1. I realize now that every German soldier, including me, shares guilt for what was done in our name. We cannot claim ignorance. We chose not to know, chose not to question. The practical re-education programs implemented during 1944-1945 moved beyond confronting Nazi crimes to teaching democratic principles, institutions, and practices that American authorities hope German POWs will carry back to post-war Germany. Selected camps establish intellectual diversion programs that essentially function as democratic citizenship schools, with courses in political science, economics, constitutional law, and comparative government systems. The most ambitious program, established at Fort Getty in Rhode Island, creates a complete university curriculum where carefully screened anti-Nazi prisoners attend classes taught by German-speaking American professors and refugee German academics who fled Nazi persecution. The Fort Getty program, nicknamed the Democracy School by participants, enrolls approximately 3,000 carefully selected German POWs in intensive courses designed to create democratic leaders for post-war Germany. Professor Henry Ehrman, a German refugee teaching political theory, describes the educational approach. We do not indoctrinate. Germans have experienced enough indoctrination. Instead, we teach critical thinking, expose students to diverse perspectives, and encourage them to examine ideas through evidence and logic rather than accepting authority blindly. We teach that democracy is not weakness but strength, that disagreement and debate strengthen rather than weaken nations, and that individual rights and human dignity represent foundations of just society. Feldwebel Schneider, selected for the Fort Getty program based on his education and demonstrated rejection of Nazi ideology, describes the transformative educational experience. The professors treat us as intelligent adults capable of understanding complex ideas, not as defeated enemies to be lectured. We read Locke, Jefferson, Mill, and other democratic philosophers. We study American and British constitutional history. We examine how democracies function, how they protect minority rights while respecting majority will, how free press and independent judiciary check government power. Most profoundly, we learn that democracy requires more than voting. It demands citizen participation, willingness to compromise, respect for opponents, and commitment to principles over personalities. These ideas feel radical after years of Nazi authoritarianism, but they resonate with something in me that propaganda had suppressed. The newspaper published by German POWs at Fort Getty, Der Ruf, The Call, evolves into the most significant intellectual forum for anti-Nazi German prisoners, publishing essays, debates, and discussions that grapple with Germany's guilt, the origins of Nazism, and the philosophical foundations needed for democratic reconstruction. The paper, while subject to American censorship preventing anti-American content, otherwise enjoys remarkable freedom to publish diverse viewpoints, including criticism of Allied policies and debate about Germany's future. The editorial stance, while clearly anti-Nazi, refuses to simply praise everything American or uncritically accept occupation policies, instead modeling the independent critical journalism that democracy requires. Hans Werner Richter, a German POW who edits Der Ruf and later becomes prominent post-war German writer, describes the publication's mission. We write not for Americans, but for Germans, prisoners here and eventually civilians in Germany. We must help Germans understand how we arrived at catastrophe, why democracy failed in Weimar, how Hitler seduced a nation, and what philosophical and institutional foundations will prevent recurrence. This requires honesty about German guilt and complicity, but also hope that Germany can rebuild on better principles. We walk a difficult line between acknowledging collective responsibility and avoiding paralyzing guilt that prevents reconstruction. The practical work experiences that German POWs have in American agriculture, industry, and communities provide concrete illustrations of democratic capitalism functioning in ways Nazi propaganda never accurately described. Prisoners observe American prosperity without understanding it as exploitative capitalism grinding workers into poverty, see labor unions negotiating with employers rather than being crushed by state power, witness diverse immigrant communities coexisting rather than racial purity being enforced, and experience religious pluralism where Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and others practice freely rather than state ideology dictating beliefs. These observations, accumulated through daily interactions rather than classroom instruction, often prove more persuasive than formal education. Gefreiter Weber, working on a Mississippi farm for 18 months, develops relationships with American farmers that humanize both populations and break down propaganda stereotypes. He describes in his memoir written decades later, "The American farmer treated me with rough kindness. He expected hard work, but paid fair wages in camp scrip, shared meals during harvest season, and discussed farming techniques as between professionals. His wife invited prisoners to Sunday dinner occasionally, though we ate separately from the family. When I asked why they showed kindness to enemy soldiers, the farmer replied, 'The war will end someday. You'll go home and help rebuild Germany. Better you remember Americans as decent people rather than enemies. Besides, you're working hard and earning your keep. That deserves respect.'" The interactions between German POWs and American civilians, while carefully supervised and limited by camp regulations, nevertheless create thousands of individual human connections that combat propaganda's dehumanization of enemies. American civilians living near POW camps develop diverse attitudes, some hostile and demanding harsh treatment, others curious and willing to engage prisoners as fellow humans. A few who actively befriend prisoners and maintain correspondence after repatriation. The positive interactions, while not universal, occur frequently enough that most prisoners have at least some experiences that contradict propaganda claims about American hatred of Germans. The correspondence between German POWs and American civilians that develops during and after the war, while sometimes romantically motivated, marriages between POWs and American women occasionally occurred, more often represents simple human connection across political divides. The letters, often beginning as prisoner requests for reading material or hobby supplies, evolve into philosophical exchanges about the war, democracy, guilt, and reconciliation. American correspondence, often motivated by religious conviction or humanitarian impulse, provide prisoners with intellectual stimulation, emotional support, and connections to wider world that isolation of captivity otherwise denies.
The repatriation of German POWs beginning in 1946 as political and logistical arrangements allow their return to devastated Germany creates a final psychological test as prisoners must reconcile their American experiences with the Germany they encounter. The physical destruction proves shocking. Cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure collapsed, economy barely functioning, population traumatized and demoralized. The psychological destruction runs deeper. A nation confronting guilt for genocide, occupation by foreign powers, political system in ruins, and uncertain future. Into this devastation return 450,000 POWs carrying experiences and ideas that make them simultaneously foreign to their own society and potentially valuable resources for democratic reconstruction. Obergefreiter Steiner, returning to his hometown in the American occupation zone in July 1946, experiences the jarring transition from American captivity to defeated Germany. He writes to his American camp commander, "I have returned to a country I no longer recognize and that no longer recognizes me. My home city is 70% destroyed. My family survived but lives in one room of a damaged building. Food shortages make American camp meals seem like impossible luxury. But the physical destruction is less disturbing than the psychological state. People are broken, defeated, uncertain how to live in this new reality. My experience in America has prepared me for democracy in ways that make me a valuable resource for military government officials implementing reconstruction. I have been appointed to local advisory council precisely because I can explain democratic principles credibly to skeptical Germans. In a strange way, my time as prisoner prepared me to help rebuild my country." The influence of repatriated POWs on post-war German reconstruction, while difficult to quantify precisely, appears significant through multiple mechanisms. POWs who attended re-education programs disproportionately enter politics, education, journalism, and other fields where they can influence public opinion and institutional development. Their first-hand experience of democratic society functioning makes them credible advocates when explaining democratic principles to populations skeptical after Nazi propaganda and military defeat. Their capacity to acknowledge German guilt while maintaining hope for redemption provides psychological model that helps Germany move beyond paralysis of collective shame toward constructive reconstruction. The political careers of former POWs demonstrate their disproportionate influence on post-war German democracy. Several members of the first post-war Bundestag were former POWs, including some who attended re-education programs in America. Their speeches often reference their POW experiences as transformative encounters with democracy that shaped their political philosophies. Local government positions throughout American occupation zones were frequently filled by former POWs, recommended by American military government officials who had evaluated their political reliability during captivity. The influence extends beyond formal politics to cultural production. Writers, journalists, and educators whose POW experiences influenced their work, shaping post-war German society. Lieutenant Hoffman, pursuing university education after repatriation and eventually becoming secondary school teacher, describes his role. "I teach German history and civics to young people who grew up under Nazism or war's chaos. I do not hide my past. I explain that I was a Nazi, believed the propaganda, fought for an evil regime, and only discovered truth as prisoner in America. I tell students about confronting evidence of Holocaust, about learning democratic principles, about discovering that strength lies not in authoritarian control, but in citizen participation and rule of law. My personal transformation makes these lessons credible in ways they would not be coming from someone without such experience. I am trying to ensure that my students never make the mistakes my generation made." The marriages between German POWs and American women, while representing a tiny fraction of total POW population, nevertheless symbolize possibility of reconciliation and human connection transcending political enmity. Approximately 5,000 German POWs married American women during or shortly after the war, requiring special permission from authorities and often overcoming significant social prejudice. These marriages, when successful, created family networks spanning the Atlantic and personal connections that contributed to post-war German-American friendship. The children of these unions, growing up bicultural and bilingual, often became bridges between German and American society in subsequent decades. The psychological research conducted by American military psychiatrists and psychologists studying German POWs provides insights into Nazi indoctrination's effects and democratic re-education's possibilities. Studies document that younger prisoners with less education prove more susceptible to re-education than older, more ideologically committed officers. Research shows that confronting atrocity evidence produces various responses, ranging from denial to acceptance, with intellectual sophistication and prior education correlating with greater likelihood of acknowledging truth. Studies examining long-term effects find that POWs exposed to intensive re-education programs show more democratic attitudes and behaviors in post-war Germany compared to POWs who experienced only minimal exposure to democratic education. The contrast between German POW experiences in Soviet captivity versus American captivity illustrates how different approaches to prisoner treatment produce different outcomes. German POWs in Soviet hands experienced harsh conditions, high mortality rates, forced labor under brutal conditions, and intense ideological indoctrination that often produced resentment rather than conversion. Many prisoners held by Soviets returned to Germany after years of harsh captivity as bitter anti-communists, whose experiences reinforced Cold War divisions. The relatively humane American treatment, while partly reflecting practical considerations like Geneva Convention compliance and public relations concerns, produced POWs more likely to embrace democratic values and support Western orientation in Cold War Germany. The memoirs and oral histories provided by former German POWs decades after their American captivity consistently emphasize the psychological impact of encountering a society that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda taught them. The testimonies described not single moment of conversion, but gradual accumulation of observations that eventually overwhelmed indoctrination. The abundance of food when propaganda predicted starvation, the humane treatment when brutality was expected, the intellectual freedom when suppression was anticipated, the evidence of Nazi crimes when denial was automatic, and the functioning democracy when chaos was prophesized. The transformation these men experienced proved neither universal nor complete, but occurred frequently enough and deeply enough that 450,000 returning POWs represented significant resource for democratic reconstruction. Feldwebel Schneider, reflecting in 1985 interview at age 68, summarizes his POW experience. The 2 years I spent as prisoner in America saved me intellectually and morally. The Nazis had trained me to believe lies about virtually everything, about Jews, about democracy, about America, about the war. As prisoner, I encountered truth that shattered those lies piece by piece. The process was painful. Discovering you've believed and fought for evil causes, existential crisis. But the pain proved necessary to purge the poison of Nazi ideology and open my mind to better ideas. When I returned to Germany, I brought understanding of democracy not as abstract theory, but as lived experience. This made me useful in rebuilding my country on democratic foundations. In a strange paradox, losing my freedom temporarily helped me understand what true freedom means.
The story of 450,000 German POWs in American captivity ultimately represents an experiment in ideological transformation through humane treatment, education, and exposure to functioning democracy that exceeded Nazi propaganda's capacity to maintain its hold on true believers. The camps where German prisoners expected brutality but found adequate care, where they anticipated degradation but received basic dignity, where propaganda predicted exploitation but they encountered opportunities for growth,
These experiences created cognitive dissonance that opened minds to alternatives to Nazi ideology. Not every prisoner transformed. Some returned to Germany as unreconstructed Nazis, others simply appreciated better treatment without philosophical conversion, and many fell somewhere between. But enough prisoners experienced genuine transformation that the American POW system contributed meaningfully to post-war Germany's democratic reconstruction, proving that even in wartime, treating enemies humanely serves both moral imperatives and pragmatic interests in building peaceful post-war order. The shocked realization that swept through Obergefreiter Steiner and hundreds of thousands of fellow prisoners, that everything they'd been told was a lie, that the enemies they'd fought to destroy actually treated them better than their own government had, that democracy worked while dictatorship failed, represented not just personal epiphanies, but collectively the ideological foundation for Germany's transformation from Nazi dictatorship to democratic ally. One changed mind at a time.